All right. Good afternoon and welcome back to It's All Interesting. I am Clifford Merin, and today I have the pleasure of my guest today, Michael Pruser of DecisionDeskHQ.com. He is a great follow on X, Twitter, and he's been doing a lot of election prognostication, and we are so happy to have him on today. Michael, how are you?
I'm good, Cliff. How are you today?
I am excellent. My fellow Connecticut fellow joining the podcast. So, Michael, we are 20 days out from the election, and there is so much noise on X, on Twitter, social media, everywhere. Before we get into all of that, just tell us a little bit about you and about DecisionDeskHQ.com.
Yeah, sure. Let's see. University of Miami graduate, background in mathematics and statistics. And I've been working with DDHQ for some time now as a data fellow. What we do is a few different things, but primarily we're kind of a competitor of the AP on election night. Our job is to call the races, tally the votes, and in 2020 and 2022, we were the first ones out. Call the Senate, call the presidency for Biden. So, it's kind of a cross between data analysis and revealing the data on election night. So follow us if you want to know who's going to win before the AP tells you. We've got all kinds of embeds, and you can follow the race on DDHQ.
Perfect. And Michael, I'll give you a shout out at Michael Pruser on X, MichaelPruser. He's got some great stuff, so give him a follow. All right, Michael, as I said, 20 days out, a lot of noise out there. Let me start with, I think, what most people are looking at, which is the early vote data in Pennsylvania. There is a lot of chatter from both the left and the right. Seems like the right is taking a victory lap with the registrations. Seems like the left is taking an early victory lap with the vote by mail and the votes that have been banked. I can't make sense of any of it. I'm hoping that you can make some sense of it and explain it to the audience and to
We're
me,
gonna,
because I have
you know,
no idea.
we'll give it a shot. Listen, victory laps this early, you're going to get yourself tired before the actual race, which is November 5th, right? First, let's talk about registrations because that's kind of the thing that is going to close up on Monday. In Pennsylvania, in 2012, Democrats had a 1.1 million registration advantage. Obama won the state rather easily in 2012, and it wasn't really expected for Trump to be able to come in and win in 16. Part of the reason why he was able to do that is from 2012 to 2016, Republicans closed the registration gap by about 250,000. And so it was down to about 880,000 that year. They did the same thing in 2020. And so logically, you would think, well, it got even better for Republicans in 2020. Trump is probably supposed to hold on. And he didn't, and he lost. And here we are now in 2024, where Republicans have picked up almost 400,000 registrations in Pennsylvania. So it's only a 300,000 gap. So if you go linearly from 12 to 24, it's very positive for Republicans. They've picked up 900,000 registrations. It's something that they're kind of 50-50 with Democrats now in this state from an active registration point of view. It's where you want to be if you're structurally trying to win a state like Pennsylvania. But it's not everything. These increased registrations are not entirely new registrations. So you can't just take the 300,000 registrations that ours are up and say, well, that's 300 extra thousand votes for Trump. It doesn't work that way. These registrations are a combination of voters falling off the rolls, voters switching parties, and some new registrations. So, registrations is a tool that we use to kind of glean who has the momentum leading into an election, who's more motivated, which party base is more excited about going out and voting for the first time. But it's not the be all end all of data analysis. It's like everything else. You take a little bit of it, you use it to try and figure out what's going to happen. But if you're focused only on the registrations, it's not going to give you what you want. So overall, registrations in Pennsylvania, the news is positive for Republicans. It shows good things. The other thing that shows pretty well for Republicans right now in Pennsylvania are the requests in terms of absentees, right? So again, when you compare previous elections, Republicans get trounced in absentee mail in Pennsylvania. And that's kind of been expected. That's the norm. This year, they've made an effort to change that. They're going out and they're actually getting these applications in. And, instead of going into Pennsylvania down 1.1 million votes like they did in 2020, they're only expected to go down about 475,000 votes this year. It's still a hole. It's a big hole, but it's easier to climb out of on election day than it was in 2020. That's a positive sign for Republicans. Now, a positive sign for Democrats right now is the return rate of those absentee requests, right? So they're getting ballots back faster. It's generally speaking, Democrats typically return ballots faster than Republicans and in a greater rate because it's easier for them. All of their voters are structurally in like one spot, two spots in the state, right? You have Southeast Pennsylvania, you have Allegheny County and Pittsburgh. So it's much easier to do some ballot data collection in those areas rather than trying to sprawl across the state and collect ballots from rural voters. All of this is to say that we're 20 days out. It's very early. There are positive signs for both teams. But I think as we approach Election Day, a lot of the question marks regarding turnout and enthusiasm will be answered. It's not going to give us votes, but it will help us figure out if one party has the edge over the other.
Well, let me ask you, in terms of what you mentioned about the Democrats, is there a firewall number that would make Democrats feel comfortable going into election day itself? Because there's chatter, again, you and I probably see the same posts: 300,000, 390,000, 400,000. Is there a number in which Democrats can breathe a little easier going into election day? And is there a number where Republicans can say, oh man, we really got a good shot if our voters show up?
Absolutely not. The entire premise of a firewall is ridiculous because you're only looking at a small portion of the vote in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, more than any other state, you're only going to get about 22% of the vote before Election Day. That's a very low number. It's the lowest of any of the toss-up states. It's actually lower than most other states as well. It's not just the toss-up states.
And for context, what was the vote? What was the vote by mail in 2020?
So in 2020, the advantage in 2020 was 1.1 million ballots. Democrats returned 1.7 million and Republicans returned 600,000.
Wow.
In 2022, for the midterm, it was 600,000, D plus 600,000. So we're going to be down to 475 this year. It's kind of a finite number. That number is not going to change. Maybe plus or minus 10,000. That's the number. Now, whether or not that number is good enough is unknown to everyone. So to suggest that a firewall needs to be 450 or 500 or 550, it really needs to be backed up by turnout on election day, something that we can estimate, but we really don't know what it is. Not to mention, we don't know who's voting for who. Polling is what does that, right? So if you think of elections, there's really everything funnels into three things. It funnels into registrations, making sure that your voters are registered to vote. It funnels into turnout, making sure your voters turn out to vote. And then it funnels into actual votes, right? So when we're talking about FEC finance finance reports and ground game and all of these other things, they all funnel into one of these three buckets. The most important bucket is the vote itself, and it's the one that we just don't have the best information on. We use polling for that. That's why polling is so popular. It's always in the media because that's the one that matters most. So, in terms of a firewall idea, there's no set number. Nobody knows. If you want to feel good about creating a number and then hitting a number, great. Everyone should set goals, but I would worry that it means absolutely nothing.
And can we tell at this stage, the way Pennsylvania operates, how many ballots have been returned specifically for, let me ask it differently. We have no idea what's on those ballots, right? So we don't know if people are not voting in the presidential election. We don't know if they're voting, if they're splitting their ticket. We have no idea. None of those ballots essentially will be opened until Election Day and be counted after the polls close, correct?
Correct, right. So specifically in Pennsylvania, more than any other state, they don't actually start opening their ballots until 7 in the morning on Election Day. Other states actually get a jump on this. They start even now, 5 weeks before the election. They'll open ballots, they'll process them, they'll feed them, and they'll get them ready for the counter when the polls close. Pennsylvania doesn't do that. Pennsylvania begins opening ballots Election Day morning. Now, there's some, in terms of undervotes and overvotes and what you can expect in terms of turnout, that we can kind of figure out. But in terms of the actual vote share of whether or not you have soft Republicans returning ballots or hard Republicans turning ballots or moderate Republicans, we don't know that. So generally speaking, the mail vote is more favorable for the Democratic candidate. So whatever the firewall is, in terms of the number of ballots returned, I would expect Harris to win substantially more votes than that when all the votes are counted. Beyond that, again, best guess.
And what do you make of the both campaigns' outreach? And do we see any data yet for the low propensity voters in Pennsylvania and around the country in terms of the ballots being returned or voting early?
Yeah, so right now the returns are very high frequency. We only have about 7 million votes in nationwide. We're expected to have 70 million by election day. So that this first batch of votes that we're seeing coming back, very, very high propensity voters from every state for the most part. This election has acted like I said the other day, like a pressure valve of sorts, where the most partisan voters have just been waiting to cast their vote for 6 months, 9 months. And so we're seeing some high turnout numbers on first day of early turnout, early vote in person. We saw in Georgia, a really large number, but it's largely people who have voted in every election in the past. We really won't know these low frequency turnout numbers until we get to the back half of this. That's when it becomes hard for campaigns to turn out those voters. Early on, people are voting that always vote.
So, what did we see early on from the data? I think the polls opened yesterday for early voting in Georgia. Just to shift to that, what do we see already there?
Yeah, so we had a little more than 300,000 votes come out in Georgia. They more than doubled their first day number in terms of what their historical high was. So, I mean, I think that relates to about 4% of the statewide turnout showed up on the first day in Georgia. Considering they have 18 days of early voting, that's a really big number. And that would be a big number for any state. In terms of the spread, and again, we're seeing this in pretty much every state, it's whiter than usual in terms of demographics. In 2020 and 2022, in both of those elections, we saw a much higher share of black vote in the early vote for every state. And the states that have opened so far, we're seeing more rural vote and less urban vote. Again, this matters in a sense of you want to turn your voters out early, right? You want to get them off the books so you're not wasting money on them, spending time trying to contact them, hunting down ballots. But at the end of the day, if you're only shifting votes from election day to early, it's not going to make any difference. So too early in the process to say, but, the signs are, I'd rather be a Republican right now than a Democrat in a sense of worrying about my voters turning out. Things are looking good early for Republicans, but again, very early, and that can flip on a dime. There
Right.
could be a day where all of a sudden the trend changes and starts shooting in the other direction.
And do
That's
you mean
kind
in
of
Georgia specifically or nationally?
Well, this is a national trend. We see it in Arizona ballot returns. We're seeing it in Florida. We're seeing it in Virginia. We're seeing it in Ohio. Republicans are having a greater share of the vote early than they had in the past. So, the only thing I would say right now in terms of how to use that is that on election night, we're used to seeing these large Democratic leads early when they drop the absentee. We're probably not going to see that this year. What we're going to see is a much closer vote early and then a less of a red wave in terms of the election day vote. So, you have to prepare for a tighter margins on both sets of the vote this year. But again, this trend is nationwide. Generally, these states are connected. What we see in Georgia, for example, yesterday, I fully expect to see in the first day of North Carolina tomorrow, which is a wider electorate and a higher vote share, and probably less of an election day vote when we get there in 3 weeks.
You mentioned Virginia. It's become sort of a white whale for Republicans
Yeah.
since Barack Obama won it in 2008. They've lost every single presidential election there since. With Glenn Youngkin purging some of the voter rolls, in addition, the early vote that's come in, is there any indication that Virginia could be a long night on election night? Or is this again something where Republicans are going to be reaching for, but it's just going to come out of their reach at the end?
I would tell you that if Youngkin were on the top of the ticket, the answer would be yes. But Donald Trump is a uniquely poor candidate for Virginia. It has a high suburban population. Northern Virginia does not like him. When you look at Virginia, it's a really purple state at the state level. Legislation is divided in a sense that one seat majorities for Democrats in both houses, and the congressional vote in 2022 was only D+3. So if it weren't for the presidency where Trump lost by 10, you would look at this state as a general in play for Republican state year over year. But he had such a poor result in 2020 that it kind of skews what Virginia actually is. Now, we still have Trump at the top of the ticket for Republicans in 2024, Harris on the other side for Democrats. It's expected to be a tighter margin. It almost has to be, considering the way that the popular vote is likely to shake out and where the polls are right now. But going from down 10 to winning an election is a very, very hard thing to do. I don't think this is the year for Republicans in Virginia. The early vote, again, encouraging, but we're seeing now with more polling sites opening up in Virginia that Democrats are starting to show up a little bit more. Things are looking more normal in Virginia. And so, I'm an optimist. And if you're Republican, you can want it, but I'm confident that it's not the year for Republicans in Virginia.
All right, let me turn to the rest of the Rust Belt. Do we have any early data out of either Wisconsin or Michigan that can tell any story yet?
No, not yet. Right now, they're both on mail. They're both returning mail at a solid pace. And it looks, again, pretty normal. It's going to change a little bit when Wisconsin opens up early voting next week. We'll get to see a little bit more of what they have to offer. But these two states, specifically Wisconsin is challenging. It's not very diverse. It's extremely white. It's very old. It's the same electorate year over year. It's going to be a really tight race. Again, when you look at the last 4 or 5 high-profile races out there, Ron Johnson scraped by in 2022. Tim Michaels lost by a little bit in 2022. Trump lost by a smidgen in 2020, won by a smidgen in 2016. It's going to be that tight again. And so trying to find some sort of indicator that things have changed in Wisconsin, it's very hard because their voting pattern is identical to previous years. Their demographics don't change. Registration patterns are the same. We're in line for a really tight race there. In Michigan, there's a little bit more. There's a little bit more diversity around, Wayne County, Macomb County, Oakland County. There are some trends there that will develop over time. But again, right now, they haven't opened up there early in person. We're getting back standard mail returns, which look pretty vanilla to me in terms of what we're supposed to get. So 2 tight races, but nothing to indicate any type of large swing like the data that we've seen in the early in person in other states.
So much of this, I think, at this point is going to be on the margins. But I'm curious your thoughts. In 2016, there was this surprise of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and the Hillary Clinton campaign didn't really do itself any favors. And then all of a sudden, election night, it was like, wait, what just happened? There are states out there that this cycle nobody's really talking about because traditionally they have not been swing states probably in the last 20 years, whether it's Colorado, New Mexico, Virginia, as we discussed. Do you foresee that there could be any state for either side, whether red or blue, that on election night we're going to say, oh my goodness, this is within like 1 or 2 points. Where did this come from?
Right. So when you look at the states and the makeup right now, there's a big demographic shift, right? We see that Trump is doing a lot better with minority voters this cycle. All of the polling would suggest that it's still there. So, and Trump may be losing a little bit with whites. So when you put it in that context in terms of how states are built out, the states where you might see a Republican surprise are more minority-driven states. A state like New Mexico you bring up is an interesting one. It's one that's very loosely polled, has a high Latino population, high Hispanic population, and one where a lot of polls have shown, Donald Trump doing a lot better with Hispanics than he had in the past. So if I were to give you on a Republican side, a state that may be interesting, it's New Mexico. On the Democratic side, you see Harris doing a little bit with whites. A modest improvement, but nothing crazy. If I had to give a state where there might be a surprise, I'd probably say something in the Midwest. Kansas, Iowa, something along those lines. I don't think she can win those states, But I think you'll see a substantial move, perhaps maybe 5, 6 points to the left, where it sets up that these states may be in play down the line.
Mm,
Yeah, it's Midwest for Harris, a surprise, and it would be probably Sun Belt for Trump in terms
mm.
of overperforming expectations. Yeah.
It's really amazing looking at a map from 1992, 1996, right? And then
Just flip the
2000.
colors. Yeah, flip the
Exactly.
colors, and there, yeah, that's all you have to do. Yeah.
Exactly. But it's amazing how demographics move. There's cultural shifts in the country. It's really a fascinating thing to look at. All right. So, why? I saw an interview, and I discussed this with somebody the other day. Larry Sabato was on. He was being interviewed. He said that some of the pollsters are changing their methodology this year. He wouldn't go into exactly what it was, but that they're changing their methodology to maybe bring out some of that hidden Trump vote that's been there in 16 and 20. Is
Yeah.
there any indication that that's actually happening? Is there anything we could look at in the polling to say maybe this will be more accurate than it was in 16, 20, and even 22?
No, and that's the problem. So what we're trying to do, what polls are trying to do, they're doing two things. The first thing they're trying to do to find the hidden Trump vote is set up more geographical outputs, essentially. So if you go into a state like Wisconsin and you have like 8 different zones that you try to hit, you make those 20 zones. So you're trying to centralize on rural Trump voters, rather than having one big zone for Waukesha and one big zone for Dane. Maybe you split those out into 3 or 4, and you poll that way. You get smaller samples from larger or from more areas. That's probably going to give you the same result. The problem with finding these hidden Trump voters from an ideological point of view is that rural voters don't like answering the phone. They don't like being contacted. They're not ones to pick up the phone, answer 30 questions, and hang up the phone. They typically will hang up. They might even call you a name and do whatever you want. It's hard to get responses from them. Most of the polling we see right now, if you take a look at the crosstabs, I apologize, you should never do that. But if you do, it's all very, the response bias is educated. It's white. It's very hard. All of these polls have to weight those things down. And what you end up with is an oversample of very liberal Democratic white voters, typically women, and it skews what the results are generally going to be. I have no confidence, absolutely zero confidence, that polling will be correct this year. It was off in 16, it was way off in 20, and there are no signs to suggest that this is actually going to be, a polling victory. I would say.
Mm.
I would set us up for the idea that more likely than not, polling is going to be incorrect one way or the other. Right now, there is no way to determine who it's oversampling or undersampling for. But, the idea that I think this election right now is kind of presented as a 50-50 toss-up. We're going to be up very late Tuesday night. The election may not be called till Friday. I don't buy into any of that. I'm more confident that polling is going to miss one way substantially, where we're going to be able to call this election late Tuesday night or early Wednesday morning. Because if it is wrong in one direction, it's a pretty easy win for one of these two candidates.
Do you think, is there any credence to the noise that said the noise on the right, and there's noise on both sides. I don't mean to call either side out, but the noise on the right that says, oh, well, if you look at the polling in 16, it missed by this. If you look at the polling in 20, it missed by this. So just factor in those misses for 24, and Trump's going to cruise to a landslide.
It reminds me of a gambler who goes to the roulette table and sees 20 black numbers in a row and thinks, this is the time red's going to hit or black is going to hit again. I think it's more independent than that. I believe that these, listen, polling has been around a long time. I would not put any stock into taking results from 2020 polling and 2016 polling and putting them into 2024. There are so many variables, so many things have changed in the last 4 years. So many things about Trump have changed, demographics have changed, what the turnout is going to be, registrations have completely changed, and so methodologies have changed from pollsters too. We just don't know what they are because a lot of that is black box behind the scenes kind of stuff. When you get a poll, you get like 2 pages, 3 pages. It has top lines, it has a little bit of methodology in the back, but ultimately it's a much more complicated process in terms of how to contact voters, who's responded, the bias, whether or not a voter gives you half of a sample and then hangs up for the second half. There are all kinds of things we don't know. So I would argue that the answer to that question is no. The worst thing you can do is take what happened in 2020 and simply apply it to 2024. That's a very bad idea.
And I think you could say the same thing for I'll use the same term, the noise on the left that's talking about the 2022 midterms where the Democratic turnout was undersampled and completely overperformed expectations. But again, completely different electorate in a midterm year where Trump was not on the ballot. And you can look at it both ways. And I'm going on a little bit of a rant, but you can only both look at it both ways. Trump on the ballot is going to bring his people out, but it's also going to bring out people that are going to vote actively against him.
Trump is an amazing magnet for turnout. He is. He absolutely is. We saw it in 16, we saw it in 20, and we're probably going to see it in 24, although not to the level of 2020. You're correct. The people will come out to vote for Trump, and there will be an equally unhappy amount of people who will come out to vote against him. That we know for sure. So you're right. 2022 is a perfect example of where the polls were more favorable to Republicans leading into Election Day. And a lot of people thought this red wave was coming. And as it turns out, it didn't really materialize. I could even go to 2018, where there was supposed to be a massive blue wave in terms of the Senate and all of these other things. That didn't materialize either. If we're being honest, polling has really sucked since 2016 in terms of getting us to the end game here, which is, the idea for polling is to set an expectation going into Election Day. It's to set reasonable markers for what's possible and what's not possible. It gives you this margin of error, right? This margin of error is always plus or minus 2, plus or minus 3. Polls have far too long been outside of the margin of error when you actually look at them and figure out the end game here. So anybody who goes into 2024 looking at the polls and thinking that this is a 50-50 race, to my point earlier, I would really advise you to open your mind a little broader than that and accept a larger range of possibilities for November 5th.
All right, so where do you see the race right now? As you just mentioned, a lot of people are saying this is 50-50. Where do you see the race right now?
50-50, no. So this is where I see the race. So
perfect.
Right. So I'm going to try and analyze this just for a minute or two and break it down how I see this. There are 7 toss-up states, right? And so we have 2 states in the Black Belt, North Carolina, Georgia. We have 2 states in the Sun Belt. We have Nevada and Arizona. We have 3 states in the Rust Belt, the blue wall, essentially. Each of these groups of states present a very demographically unique set of states, right? We have more Black share of vote in the Bible Belt. We have Latino, Hispanic vote in the Sun Belt, and we have the whites up in the Rust Belt. In order for Kamala Harris to win the election, she only needs to win one of these demographics. She needs to win the blue wall, right? And so if she wins the blue wall, the white vote, she wins. There's really not a path for Donald Trump, if she's doing that well with whites in the Rust Belt, to pick off Virginia or to pick off another state as a surprise, right? 270 to 268, right? That's the outcome. If
she wins Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, she's at 270, election over.
270, right? That's it. That's the easiest path. That's the path that I believe she should be leaning into right now, which is simply, rather than kind of, I don't want to call it pandering, but rather than trying to pull in the youth Black vote, which she's doing a lot of lately, and these other things, let them go. Focus on what's working right now, which is white suburban women. Attract your message to them over the next 3 weeks and draw as many of them out as you can to win the Rust Belt. That's her path. Now, Trump needs to win a combination of he has a lot of different combinations within that, but he needs one blue wall state. He cannot win with one of those states. A lot of people believe Pennsylvania is that state. I don't believe Pennsylvania is the state. I think Michigan presents his best opportunity. Michigan gives him the demographics that are most favorable to him, which is a less educated white vote and a little bit more diversity, which isn't as white. Which sounds weird to say for a Republican, but it's actually more favorable to him this year based on the changing trend lines we see. So I think that Trump's best path is probably Michigan, then Pennsylvania, then Wisconsin. But if you asked me who I think is going to win, I would simply say right now that I would rather be Harris than Trump because her path is easier for me. That could change in 3 weeks based on the data. It might. But going in, I'm always a guy who path of least resistance. And for me, that's just winning the states that Democrats typically win. We think back, to the last 8 elections, those three states have always been connected. They've either all three of them have gone, or one for the Democrat or lost. Republicans have only won it one time. One
Mm.
time in the last 8 elections have they won the Rust Belt states. And so I feel as if not only is a little bit of history on her side, but also just, again, that she's doing a little better with the white suburban women vote, and that this is the first election since Dobbs, since January 6th. Things I know Republicans don't like to talk about, but have impacted the vote of those moderate white women suburban voters. That may be enough for her to win.
And
Lean ever so slightly Kamala Harris at this moment in time.
and what just to pick up on one thing you said, why do you think Pennsylvania is less favorable to Trump than Michigan?
Yeah, so Pennsylvania has a high suburban population in the southeast portion of the state. We saw in 2022 that vote share for Senate candidate Oz really moved away from him. It was it was during the Dobbs media circus there a little bit, and he lost by a substantially higher margin than Donald Trump did in 2020. My confidence level in terms of seeing that shift back towards Trump over the last 2 years is low. He needs to be able to do obviously better than Oz margins, but he needs to improve on his margins, because even though he'll win a really high portion of the rurals, and he's going to have amazing numbers in the rurals this year. I think we call it Pennsylvania, Kentucky, or Pennsylvania, Tucky, or whatever it is. But that area is also growing in population. That's where voters are moving to, and there's kind of a shift in population out of the rurals in Pennsylvania into the southeast suburbs of the state. So I think the demographic changes over the last 4 years, while registrations have been great, have been less favorable to Trump than in a place like Michigan, where a city like Detroit is losing population. And so that's kind of how I see Michigan a little bit higher in terms of Trump possibilities than Pennsylvania right now.
And what about, and just to get your thoughts to wrap the Rust Belt discussion up on Wisconsin, I assume that's the
Wisconsin,
least. Yeah.
yeah, it's so white. For me, it's the least favorable to him, because again, the population trends, Dane County, University of Wisconsin out there, Dane, Madison, that is just an overwhelmingly blue area. And we've seen, again, places like Waukesha just kind of pull away its vote a little bit for the Republican candidate. Ron Johnson was a Senate incumbent. He was facing a slightly, I would say, below average candidate in Mandela Barnes for the state in terms of Wisconsin. He squeaked by in 2022.
Won by less than a percentage,
A
basically.
red
Right?
wave
Yeah.
year, right? I think things are shifting away from Republicans in Wisconsin. Ron Johnson should have won by more that year, and he didn't. And so my hope in terms of seeing a Republican winning, I think Harris is doing. I like Harris for Wisconsin. In terms of the kind of predictive models of the 7 swing states, I would put Georgia's favorability at the top of Trump's list, and I would put Wisconsin's favorability at the top of Harris's list in terms of what's most likely to happen.
Let me ask you something about polling, which I know we discussed a little bit. You take a state like Arizona, which I think is trending toward Trump for this election. I think you would agree with that.
Yeah.
Why and how do we see a poll, let's say by the New York Times, a month ago, that says Harris +5, and then 30 days later you see a poll that says Trump +5? How could that even happen?
It generally has to do with sample sizes and response rates, right? So before touching on that poll, I think there was a Marist poll, national poll, that had just come out yesterday that showed Harris +5. The previous Marist poll was even, right? A 5-point swing in a matter of a week or 10 days. And when you look into it, this particular poll had a sample size of D+7, where the previous poll had a sample size of D+1, right? So these wild swings we see in polls have to do with sample sizes. Now, in an individual poll, really doesn't matter. It's one poll. It's a sample of 1,000 people in a state in terms of Arizona, 4.3 million registered voters. It's not going to give you anything valuable. The idea is that you take that 1,000 sample, you add it into what is already a 40,000 sample from the 40 other polls, and it's supposed to help a little bit, right? Every additional sample is supposed to tighten the bands in terms of the possible margins of a poll. So, +5 one way, +5 the other way, that's all okay. I kind of like that for polling. That's the way it should be. But at the end of the day, when November 5th comes rolling around, you take a look at the 50 previous polls, you throw them all in the bucket, and it gives you a number. That's the number that I would be most confident in terms of how this is supposed to work. If polling were working, That's the way it's supposed to work. So seeing
Mm.
intra-week swings of 5 points, 6 points, 8 points sometimes, that's okay. I kind of like that. Different polls have different samples. They use different methodologies. They're supposed to be different. I much prefer that than to see the Emerson release of 7 swing state polls that shows tie, 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 tie. That's no value. That's you might as well not even poll if you're doing that, because then your methodology is kind of your ends justify the means type of situation. Yeah.
It seems like this year there's this inverse reality going on in some of the Senate races. The Republican nominees in the competitive seats are all running way behind Trump. And then the Democratic nominees, some of them don't even want to appear with Harris
Yeah.
at events, right? And they're in a stronger position in some of those tight races. So I think we can safely say West Virginia is off the board. So right,
If we can't say that, then we can't say anything. Then
right,
yeah, yeah,
right.
West Virginia's off the board. Yeah.
Do, are you looking at Montana as off the board yet? Or is that something? I know Tester has had real strength there over the
Yeah.
last however many years he's been in.
This is his fourth run. Yeah. Is Montana off the board? No, but it's barely hanging on the board. It's a state that, listen, Tim Sheehy is supposed to win. Part of the reason that Republicans haven't done well in Montana over the years is they've run a set of slightly underwhelming candidates, but also that Tester is viewed as strong. I think that's a misnomer. When you go back and you look at John Tester and you look at his results as compared to the other Democrats running in the state, his performance is good, but it's not great. He is not this world-beating overperformer to the likes of, say, Susan Collins in Maine. He's good. He's very good, but Republicans have found a good candidate this time, and they found him at the right time in terms of the national environment. Right? If we were coming off of a Donald Trump presidency in 2024 and it was more of a Democratic environment, I could see a guy like Tester winning Montana again. But set aside the polling for a second. Registrations are coming in more in Republican favored counties right now in Montana. And we actually had a pretty good glean in the primary. It's the only state, I think, in the country where more than 50% of the registered voters actually turned out. And they turned out in Montana for the primary. So we got a pretty good sample size in terms of the voters that are actually going to show up this election. And it was overwhelmingly for Sheehy in terms of the Dem to Republican split. It's very, very hard to outrun a guy like Donald Trump at the top of the ticket by 20 points, which is what his expected margin in Montana is going to
Mm.
be. I don't think Tester has it in him this year. It's very unlikely. So I think that Montana is it's not safe, but it's likely at this point for Republicans. And then you start looking at places like Ohio as seat number 52.
Yep,
You would go to
that's what I was going to
Michigan.
ask you about
Yeah,
next. So how are
Michigan
you look
53. Yeah,
before we get to Michigan? Yeah.
yeah.
So how are you looking at the Moreno Brown race at this point?
Well, I think Moreno has actually run a better race than expected. I went into this thinking that Brown was going to win. He also is a bit of an overperformer in Ohio. Again, not a world beater, but a good performer. And Moreno was a hard right candidate that I didn't think was the right choice for Republicans in the primary. I think that they had an easier path with Matt Dolan if he had won. But he can win. I think that in terms of a race, this is a true toss-up race for me, Ohio. I think that this is a true 50-50 set. I would lean one way or the other in just about any Senate race, but Moreno has closed the gap. It's a race where you would have expected him to already be ahead in terms of just how the state is structured and Trump expecting to win by 8 to 10 points. But unlike Montana, Brown only has to make up, again, 8 to 10 points. He doesn't have to make up 20 points. He can do that with some of the, again, moderate, soft Republicans. That is going to be probably, as I see it, the closest race in the Senate I'm expecting. I think that's probably a 1 to 2 point win for somebody. Who it is, I really don't know. Again, you look at Ohio turnout, it's favorable for whites, it's favorable for Republicans right now. We don't know what that's going to look like on election day, but I don't have it's a true orange state for me, toss up.
Does it hurt Moreno or any of these other candidates, left or right, blue or red, in states where the presidential race is not as competitive? So when you're from behind, like Moreno is, if Ohio was maybe more competitive, could you make the argument that there would be more people voting in that state?
Absolutely, but it works both ways, right? So in a state that is more democratically structured, that is favorable to Harris, it works the same way on one of these states. So I would say, in a state like Ohio, where Republicans have the advantage, you want as many voters to turn out as possible. More voters that in an R+8 state, that's more beneficial to Moreno. It's only because of the way the map is structured this year that all of the Senate possibilities are really in the toss-up zone for where Democrats have incumbents, right? So we're talking about Michigan, where it's a Democratic incumbent. We're talking about Nevada, that's an open seat. Nevada, Democratic incumbent. One of the places that I think is on the board that a lot of people don't think where this plays the other way is Maryland. I know it's Maryland, but Larry Hogan is
Very,
someone
very popular former governor.
right. And so the thing with Maryland for me is that a lot of pundits, a lot of models have it as safety, and that's just ridiculous to me because it doesn't play like Chuck Schumer in New York. These are not the same races in terms of safety. There's not a lot of data out of Maryland. We really don't have a ton of polling, maybe 4 or 5 polls in the last 5 months for this particular race, and it's completely unknown. You have an extremely popular governor who's running a very moderate race. He's almost running as a very moderate Democrat in terms of the way he talks. Right? He takes every shot he can at Donald Trump, and he knows what it takes to win in Maryland. So that's a state where in Maryland, you would want as many people turning out for also Brooks because it's an extremely Democratic state, but there's not a lot of money flowing in there. So a depressed turnout might be beneficial to a guy like Hogan. Um, you know, I, I think that Maryland is infinitely more possible for Republicans than Arizona in terms of the Senate this year. So, it's a weird spot to be in, but yes, absolutely. When you don't have a presidential race in your state, and you're running as the candidate where the favorables are strong for that party, it's a bit of a disadvantage. You would have preferred Ohio to be closer or for money to be spent so that you can turn out more of your voters. Absolutely.
And what do you make of the Pennsylvania Senate race? I know Bob Casey is an institution there, but
Yeah,
McCormick is pouring a lot of money from our home state,
yeah, right.
McCormick from our home state,
Yeah.
right, into that Pennsylvania Senate race.
So I went into this thinking that Casey had it in the bag. I thought McCormick wasn't going to be a strong candidate in Pennsylvania for one of the reasons you mentioned. Similar to Sam Brown in Nevada, he's from Texas, right? Mike Rogers voted in Florida in 2022. A lot of the Republican candidates for Senate aren't really like lifers in the state that they're in, and Casey is a lifer in Pennsylvania. But to the credit, I would say that of all the Senate candidates, I think Hogan has run the best race for Republicans. I think McCormick has run the second best race. He's been very strong. He's been on message, on brand. His ads have been very strong. He's poured in all of his money into this race, right? Self-funder, which really helps Senate Leadership Fund and other things. So, I kind of went into this expecting a 4-point difference between Trump and McCormick. I could be very convinced right now that that's under 2 right now, maybe even under 1. The polling is tightened, but he's run a really good race, and so I'm more convinced now than I was a few months ago that he has a legitimate shot. It's not a great shot. It's not something that I would put money on, but if you ran this 5 or 6 times, he'd probably win one of them. And I think that's probably about as best you can do with an entrenched incumbent in a state like Pennsylvania, like Bob Casey.
All right, let me move on to the House. There's not a ton of data at this point because there's so much focus on the presidential and the Senate races. Looks like there's maybe 20 to 35 toss-up seats that will decide the House of Representatives. Do you think the House is basically going to go whichever way the presidential race goes? Is that a safe way to look at it?
I think it's a safe way to look at it if Donald Trump wins the presidency. I wouldn't be so sure about Harris. And the reason I say that again is because the demographic shifts right now. If Harris is doing a little better with whites and she holds on to the blue wall, I don't think that necessarily means that the Republicans lose the House. They can pick up a lot of the toss-up states in California based on the Hispanic vote, a couple of toss-up states in Texas, and other areas where they may still be okay for the House. I think if Harris does lose the election, though, it means that her improvement with whites probably isn't very good, and that Donald Trump is still doing really well with minorities that probably translate to other Republicans for the House. So I think that's more of a correlation for one way rather than the other. But it's yeah. If Harris wins, I guess substantially, some sort of 300 to 232 victory or one of those types of things. Yeah, those both of those things are going to go the same way. Senate is very likely R at this point, and I think that the House and the presidency are true toss-ups. Yeah.
Hmm. Well, Michael, this has been absolutely fantastic. One more question before I let you go. Tell me a little bit more about Decision Desk HQ. How do you guys operate so quickly during election cycles? I follow you on X, and I always have your page up during election night because you're always accurate, and it's always efficient, and it's always quick.
Yeah, well, we've got the best people here, Cliff. I think the AP suffers from what a lot of institutions suffer from, which is administrative bloat. You're talking about running systems through 4,000 different people and trying to figure out all of these different strategies to call. And it's really about hard work, efficiency, and knowing the math. It's just that simple. So you put the work in early, you set up states the proper way, you set turnout expectations, you set out the vote, and we've got people on the ground to pull vote all the places we need to pull it from. We get the results faster than anyone. We can call the races faster than anyone. Maybe the AP was fine in 2004, 2008. That's great, good for them. But we're 2024 now. There are updated ways and more better use of technology in order to call these races. And I'm confident that in 2024 you'll see us as the first one to call most, if not all, of these high profile races.
All right. Well, everybody can check out Michael Pruser at Michael Pruser on X and, of course, at DecisionDeskHQ.com. Michael, thank you so much, and I hope we have you on again before the election.
Yeah, maybe one more time. I'm probably going to say the exact same thing with a tweak, but you got it, Cliff.
All right. Perfect. Thank you. And let's go Mets for both of us.
Oh, big game today. Thanks,
Right?
Cliff.